Hello, everybody. This is Georgianne Hughes, and this is The Bite Show. And we have Olaf Hage on the line, and you can visit his personal website, thetimequest.com, and he also has a distributor's website where he has CDs and things for sale, and you can purchase for immediate listening Olaf's private audio files, and that site is before 2012 and beyond.com. And tonight Olaf is going to talk to us about, oh boy, Gobekli Tepe. Hi, Olaf.
Hi, Georgianne, and your Turkish is not that bad, actually.
Oh.
Yeah, there is a new discovery. It's actually an old discovery. That is to say, for about 16 years, Dr. Schmidt from Germany has been excavating at Gobekli Tepe. Think about Gobekli Tepe, like a Indian teepee or something.
Yeah.
That would give you that's pretty close. It actually means pot-belly hill, or in the immortal words of Hebrew, Atel, T-E-L, or T-E-L-L. And it simply means a hill, or hillock, or a rounded mound covered with dirt, inside of which, when they unearth these things, they find stones and foundations and artifacts and so forth. Now, over the past couple of decades or so, actually going back a lot further than that, the archaeologists have been gradually unearthing cities or towns or even little villages and so forth. And Gobekli Tepe is not actually any of those things. It has proved to be something of a riddle because of its age, because of its location, and because of the fact that it seems to have been deliberately buried multiple times by the people who built it. And so it has seemed to be a mystery. And because nobody seemed to have lived there, although they've only excavated about 10% of it so far in 16 years, oh gosh, that little brush that they brush away the dirt with very slowly,
Yeah.
one grain of dust at a time. Yeah, well, that's what's going on over there. And so at the rate they're going, it will take 160 years to expose this one town.
Wow.
Well, it's not a town. It appears to be a religious site. And it is in the middle of a collection of sites that date to up to about 13,000 BC on down to about 6,000 BC. Now, nothing's supposed to date to that period. And we have that on the authority of a very interesting fellow. His name is, or was, V as in Victor, middle name Gordon, Child, C-H-I-L-D-E. He was from Australia, and he went to Britain, and he became an archaeologist. Or maybe he was an archaeologist and then he went to Britain. I don't know which, but anyway, he got to Britain. And in the early 20th century, 100 years ago, he quickly emerged as one of the great leaders of modern archaeology. But that's a little misleading. He was an atheist, a Stalinist, and a Marxist.
Oh.
And he couldn't leave his politics out of his archaeological theories. And he championed the idea that mankind had emerged 200,000 years ago. You thought that was a recent idea? 200,000 years ago, and had only about 6,000 years ago subtly gotten inspired at Sumer to engage in agriculture, that changed everything. That once they discovered that they could grow their own food and they didn't have to wander around foraging and hunting and so forth, human beings could finally settle down and build a town and start civilization and set up schools, educate their young, and have a government, and learn reading and writing and arithmetic, and grow apples for the teacher and all the rest of that crap. And so he said, and others followed him, like Samuel Noel Kramer in the 1960s, history began at Sumer. Civilization began at Sumer. Writing began at Sumer. Religion began at Sumer. The idea was, while you're waiting for the crops to grow, if you get a little worried that maybe the weather's not working in your favor, you get religious about it. You start to engage in rituals to make the rain fall and to make the crops grow. And so he thought that religion was a product of a settled human environment. And he called all of what was happening at Sumer the Neolithic Revolution. Now, revolution because for 200,000 years we just went around picking berries, according to him, and killing anything that happened to cross our path that we were able to kill. And that suddenly, about 6,000 years ago, we magically invented agriculture at Sumer, and it then gradually spread from there to the rest of the world. And prior to that time, therefore, there were no cities like Gobekli Tepe. There was no stone architecture or civilization or writing or carved symbols or art or music or boats or clothing or any of that stuff. That this stuff just, well, maybe there was clothing in the sense of somebody wearing an animal skin to keep warm during the Ice Age. But from his perspective, cultivated grain, all of this stuff just suddenly emerges at Sumer. History begins at Sumer. Technology, civilization begins at Sumer, and it's 6,000 years ago. We now know that virtually everything he said was false. I want that to sink in. The Marxist was wrong. Okay? What actually happened? Well, at first, archaeologists were being presented with hard physical evidence for urban development prior to 6,000 years ago, and they said, well, this must be a fluke. Or this account in some ancient writing, well, that's just a myth. That's just a legend. Or, whatever it was, they kept dismissing it and dismissing it and dismissing it and saying, well, that can't be right. And then about 35, almost 40 years ago, they started looking again at these cave paintings at Lascaux in France and other caves in Spain and really in various places along southern Europe and on into Yugoslavia and into Russia. Even there's some areas where the so-called caveman lived. And they discovered, as they studied it more carefully, that these guys actually knew a lot about, well, first of all, they could build fires, they made tools, they made jewelry, they apparently buried things, jewelry with their dead loved ones, and buried their dead loved ones very carefully and lovingly, indicating that perhaps they believed in some sort of spiritual afterlife. And of course, according to Gordon Childe, why, that's not possible because religion is a product of civilization. First, mankind develops, advanced urban centers, and then, and only then, after he's trying to figure out why the crops aren't growing, does he start to invent a god to explain everything. But of course, that's not what the evidence was showing. And then we found cave paintings that had artistic expression as beautifully rendered as anything that any modern artist could do. And they looked at this and they said, well, this stuff's 35,000 to 40,000 years old. And, they could measure charcoal and the age of it that was used in the paintings as a kind of a sketch. The same way, by the way, artists use charcoal today to outline what they're going to paint. And so they said, well, these guys, they were awfully artistic, but that's just a fluke. And then they started to measure the brain sizes and chart that. And they realized these guys had like 2,000 cc brain capacity, whereas modern man has only about 1,350. They had brain cases able to hold a brain 50% larger than ours. And we're not talking some kind of weird slope-headed Neanderthal skull here. We're talking about somebody with a high frontal lobe neocortex. Very well developed. These guys clearly were very much in the same vein as modern humans anatomically. And they were bigger than we were. Whereas modern man averages 5 feet, 8.5 inches. Some of our younger people today seem to be a little taller because of our nutritional revolution since World War II. But that was the standard up through the 1960s. If you go back to 30, 45,000 years ago, during what is sometimes called the Magdalenian period, I believe, these guys were 6 feet 4 inches tall on average. So they were just bigger in every respect. And they were athletically built. They weren't like hunched over. They were just ordinary humans. If you can imagine some guy participating in the decathlon at the Olympics and just bump him up about 50% larger in weight and about a foot, well, maybe not a foot higher, but 6 inches higher on average, and with a 50% larger brain case, and you've got yourself one of these guys who's doing the cave paintings. So they said, well, gee, that's interesting. How can he have such a highly developed brain and be so advanced in terms of human physiology, and yet this guy doesn't know how to read and write, he hasn't got any other inventions, he's still working in the Stone Age. And then they began to notice some of the paintings and some of the artifacts that were lying around, little sculptures that he made, that this guy had woven cloth. And I'm thinking, oh my goodness, they wore tailored clothing. They knew how to weave. And now they're starting to get a little curious, and they're thinking, well, what else did this guy know? Not just one person, but, that group of humanity that was alive at that time. And they discovered that they had to have boats to get from where they were to where their cousins were found offshore in other locations, especially down in Southeast Asia, where they found them in Australia and in the Indonesian islands and so forth. They said, well, at the time they had to cross by water. They needed to have some kind of vessel to do that. And slowly but surely they began to piece it together. They found musical instruments. And they found that they were keeping a calendar. And so the Stone Age man was beginning to seem a little less cavemanish, a little less like he should be in a Geico ad. And slowly but surely, they began to realize that, well, maybe this guy was a little more advanced than we thought. Maybe he's not the troglodyte that we had classed him as being because of Gordon Child and people like him. And so then they started to look at something else. They asked the question, well, these cave drawings and so forth, maybe we should go back and look and see if perhaps there might be some writing here that we missed. And lo and behold, they began to notice all sorts of symbols that we still haven't translated that suggest the possibility. They're just little, like, crude drawings, pictograms and things, but there is a hint of something that might have been symbolic of language. And so that got the language guys to look at the lyrics. They started looking at the skulls and they said, well, could they have had the ability to speak the way we do, to communicate the way we do? And they said, oh yes. In fact, their ancestors could speak. And so they realized language, human language, went back even before these guys, even before the so-called cavemen who did the paintings. And now that started to bother them a lot because, again, according to their paradigm, according to this worldview that this Marxist Gordon Childe had put forward, they weren't doing anything. There was little or no change in humanity for almost 200,000 years until 6,000 years ago, when magically they started to learn how to read and write because of the discovery of how to cultivate grain and produce agricultural produce. So they thought, well, we've got evidence here that mankind had developed a lot more skills a lot earlier than we ever thought. But still, we haven't found any cities. We haven't found any towns. And then about 18,000 years ago, they found evidence for what appeared to be some sort of village. And even worse, they found signs of agriculture going on the Fayum, which is a depression to the west of the Nile, south of the Delta. And if you look at a map of Egypt, you see that kind of little lake or area. I think it's called Moeris on some maps. It depends on exactly which map you look at. And that area there, that's known as the Fayum. And it was, they found cultivated grain in there. Dated 18,000 years ago, right after a period when Egypt had been subjected to an extremely severe famine. In fact, the whole Middle East had. And so they thought, well, and this was in the heart of the Ice Age. And here they are engaged in agriculture in the heart of the Ice Age. This is totally contrary to everything that everybody believed. Not supposed to happen. Well, slowly but surely, people were unearthing little stone villages and little sites of human habitation, and they were pushing them back further and further in time. And they were going back before 6,000 years. And there was Urfa, or Ur, in southern Turkey, the site of Edessa, and the modern Shadley Urfa. And that's very close to this place we're talking about here, Gobekli Tepe, which is really just the center of a whole series of other sites, all of which we need to discuss, although I can't discuss each one individually, but we'll cover them in a larger sense. And one by one, they found these little places. Now, some of them had only about 10 people, they figure, were living there, maybe 20, very small locales. Some of them had about 100 people, they figure, a small village. And others had maybe 1,000 people living in them. And they started to date these. And, of course, they used carbon-14 as their primary method of dating because at that distance, there wasn't a whole lot else they could resort to. There are a few things you can use, but if they don't have pottery, you can't use some of the thermal luminescence methods that they were using or some of the pottery style methods that they like to use for more recent things. So when they weren't finding pottery in these places, they said, well, what do we got to do? Well, we got to rely on carbon-14. The problem is that when you get back about 10,000 years ago, there's no way to calibrate it. There's no tree ring calibration for the carbon-14. So we know for a fact that it can be off anywhere from 500 to 2,000 or more years at that distance because of the fluctuations in climate that were occurring and the fluctuations in solar activity that affect carbon-14. So they had to sit down and start dating these places one by one. So Gobekli Tepe turned out to date from about 9600 BC down to approximately 8200 BC. And so here was about 1400 years, and they found that there, I can explain something here. I know they haven't excavated all of it, but what they did was they used thermal imaging and satellites to discover that there were about 20 sets of buried stoneworks in this place where apparently nobody lived. And what these stones look like is very interesting. They're very thin stone, about maybe 12 inches thick, and then about 4 or 5 feet wide, maybe 18 feet tall. So you just kind of try to picture it's like a blade sticking out of the ground. So it reminds you a little bit of Stonehenge because they're in circles. And at the top, there's like a T-shaped top, which actually represents the head and shoulders, if you will, of a man. And the sides of the structure of the stone is a big chunk of granite, very well shaped and obviously very precisely done. Stonehenge is rough and crude looking. These are very well-shaped stones. They look like anything that you would find today in a stone structure now. I mean, it's not polished, but it's, after all these years, you wouldn't expect it to be polished anymore. It may have been very nicely polished when it was originally done. We don't know, but it's rough now after all these thousands of years gone by. And they would sculpt hands and arms and fingers so that you could see that it was actually a symbolic man. And you'd see his waist, you'd see his belt, you'd see other things that he was wearing. Again, it's all in a rectangular form, so it's very symbolic. It's almost modern art. In fact, I would have to say it is modern art, except for the fact it's 10,000 years old. So, but it looks modern. And so each of these stone monoliths, and there are dozens of these things, is a symbolic human being. And they would put on the outside, either carved or using reliefs or just sculptures that stick out, they would put various animals and insects and birds and things, which I suspect has something to do with the name of the person or something to do with a symbol, in other words, that relates to what the person was called. So that it's sort of like when you go to a stained glass window at a church in Europe, a lot of people were illiterate. And so to show them that this was Mary Magdalene, they put a red egg in her hand. And the red egg would symbolize Mary Magdalene. And she'd have red hair. And that was how you knew that it was Mary Magdalene. Or if it were Jesus, he would have a cross of halo behind his head, whereas somebody else would just have a simple circle. And you knew it was Jesus because he had a cross in the halo behind his head. And so they used this symbolic language to tell you, who you're looking at. Well, it looks like at Gobekli Tepe that they were doing the same thing, that they were using symbols to designate who this person was, and that there was enough common knowledge of people that they would take one look at it and say, oh, that's Uncle Charlie, or whatever. It doesn't look like Uncle Charlie because Uncle Charlie's not a rectangle, but the way they represented the animals on the sides of these stone monoliths, they could recognize who it was, or who it was intended to be. Well, on the side of one of them, they have some limited pictures. I'm using, by the way, this article in the June 2011 issue of National Geographic, and it's the cover story. So you can actually see one of these right on the cover. Well, actually, two of them. I look at it, there's one in the background here as well. And in there's a photograph that shows one of these, and you can look to the side in the shadow. It's actually on page 34. It's the opening page of the article itself. And if you look to the left side, there are symbols there, and they have letters like C, what look to us like C, H, let me see, C, H, C, H, D, or delta, and they have all of these different little indications of what looks like some sort of language. Now it's a little hard to see because the thing, and this is really interesting, the sides, the long sides of the or wide part of the sides of this vertical rectangle curve slightly. Yeah, you heard me right. There's a slight curvature to them. So if you take a picture, the front part you can read, but then the back part starts to curve away from you. So this is a very sophisticated stone carving. I mean, it could hold up in any modern context. You would never know it was ancient unless somebody told you. It's really quite extraordinary. And because these people buried them after they had been exposed to the elements for only a limited period of time, after maybe a few decades, they're thinking that they were buried on average every 70 years. There's about 20 of them. And for 1,400 years, they would erect these things for about 70 years. At the end of 70 years, then they would bury them. And they would basically be erecting a circle of them, and at the end of 70 years, they would bury the circle. And they start all over again. And they're thinking, well, that is, the archaeologists are thinking, well, this is a religious site, and these are gods, and we don't know why they're burying their gods. Well, I looked at this, and I looked at what appears to be writing on the side of them. And remember now, this is not 6,000 BC, this is 9,600 BC. This is 3,600 years. That's further than we are from the Exodus. 3,600 years before Sumer. Actually, it's more than that, because Sumer really doesn't get rolling till around 3,400 BC. So this is really over 4,000 years before Sumer. So these guys, they think, well, this is not writing, it's just decoration. Once again, they look at these symbols, they see something that could be writing, but because of Gordon Childe, it can't be, because the Sumerians invented writing, right? Well, maybe not. Because here are classic Hebrew letters, that is to say, Proto-Hebraic language, or sometimes called Phoenician. Not too far from Phoenicia. Actually, it's a walk from Phoenicia, from where this is. And here are these symbols that, if this were a Phoenician site, everybody would be translating. But because it's not, and because it's so much earlier, everybody's afraid to translate it because of this dead atheist Marxist, this Stalinist. I mean, he's not even a Leninist. He was a Stalinist. And, I mean, it's embarrassing. Oh, not to me. It's embarrassing to the archaeologists that they are unwilling to look at what these symbols might mean. Because, after all, if these are Proto-Hebraic, and they're on a monolith that's 3,600 or more years before Sumer, well, that's a problem. Because that would mean that Sumer wasn't the first language. This predated Sumerian. So the people of Sumer were coming up with a language that followed this, and it looks, for all the world, like these are Hebrew characters. Kaith, Haith, Kaith, Dalet. Looks, although in Hebrew it would be Dalet, Haith, Kaith, Dalet. Excuse me, I'm sorry, Haith. Or as we would say, D-E-K-E. And then there seems to be another letter that's hard to see, and I've got to guess that that's another Kaith. So it would be D-E-K-E-K. Dekak. But we can't see what the rest of it is in this photograph, so it's hard to tell. But so it looks like there's language here. It looks like there's something that looks familiar language on a stone monolith dated 9600 BC. Well, now we have a problem. Nobody lived there, which means the civilization, the culture that built this must extend over a broad area. And you would need to have hundreds, if not thousands, of people to do the granite work here. I mean, we're talking people cutting granite out of the ground and hauling it from maybe miles away, uphill to the top of this ridge near ancient Edessa. And it obviously was some kind of ceremonial site on a hilltop. And then they would cover it up after the men that it symbolized, I would think, were dead. 70 years, it's about a human or family, extended family life expectancy. And when the guy's son was dead, and when that family was no longer, say, ruling or whatever, they'd bury that. They start a new circle to represent a new family line that's been elected or chosen or whatever to take his place. And after about 70 years on average, I guess they died out. They buried that family, so to speak, that family of stones. They started a new one. I think that's a straightforward, simple way of doing it. And why are they symbolically burying their stones? Well, if you make a stone to represent somebody, I guess that you symbolically bury it. It's a symbolic stone. The whole place is about symbolism, and fairly elaborate symbolism at that, including what appears to be alphabetic language. So these guys are all excited about symbols, and certainly language would fall into that category. And it could be that these are people who taught them language, who invented language, but just like in Egypt, we have a reverse chronology problem. The best, most sophisticated, most architecturally and artistically advanced stuff comes first, not last. So what it looks like is that these guys started out very talented, and then they slowly lost their ability to copy this format. Well, that raises an interesting question. If you look back to Egypt, forward to Egypt, for example, the Great Pyramid, one of the very first pyramids, very advanced, and then there's a whole bunch of pyramids that follow it, getting steadily more crude as time goes by and less impressive. Now, there were a couple tree pyramids that preceded, over a fairly short period of time, the Great Pyramid. So you have a really short learning curve and then a long period of decline. And you have the zenith located near the beginning. And they think that Imhotep, so some people think that, I think that Imhotep was the designer of the Great Pyramid and the builder of it. And he was this great architectural genius. So Imhotep was a genius, comes up with the idea, develops the technology over the course of a few decades, and then finally tackles the Great Pyramid itself after experimenting with other structures. And he may have died before it was completed, but he left behind plans, and eventually some feel, I feel anyway, that he was buried in his own pyramid. That is the Great Pyramid. And then after him come people who knew not Imhotep and whose skills were less developed, who tried to copy what he did, but they lacked his inventive, creative genius. So they're just copying, and crudely so. And their projects are less ambitious, and their designs less stable. And they slowly deteriorate over the centuries until finally pyramid building comes to a halt. And with it, the Old Kingdom in Egypt, essentially. And then there is a great intermediate period of about 1,500 years. And the land is reduced to famine and cannibalism. And then order is restored, and you have the Middle Kingdom. And it goes on for a considerable period of time. And we have another intermediate period, the second intermediate period, and another time of chaos. And again, you have the New Kingdom following that, and you eventually find that merging with the Persian invasion, Cambyses, and you get down around 500 BC, and eventually down to Alexander, who is the last of the pharaohs at the end of the process. Okay, so what we can see here is a strange process of declining civilization. And we see that also here at Gobekli Tepe. Some really great leader, some very imaginative great leader starts the process going. They erect a stone in his honor. Maybe it was a meeting place where people from the various villages would get together to hold an annual confab or convention or law-giving ceremony where he would come and listen to their complaints and so forth, and he would issue his rulings, and then when he was finished, why, he would go back home to wherever he was living at the time, and everybody else would disperse to where they were living. And then, they'd repeat till the guy dies, and then his son takes over, and he gives his rulings, and the same thing until the family dies out. They bury all their stones. They dedicate a stone to each of these guys, and maybe, that's where that person would stand to give their judgments, their judgment seat, as it were. So that would be my interpretation of it, instead of some of the primitive religious interpretations of it. So now, in this article, they have a map showing all of these different sites. And being the chart crazy guy that I am, I decided to go and chart it. So I turned their map into a chart, and I charted it two ways. So one method I used was by location. And I wanted to see if there was some kind of locational difference. And there kind of was. The two oldest sites are in Israel. And they go back almost to 13,000 years ago. Or, 15,000 years ago. Which, for those of you who have listened to my 2012 recording with Georgianne, know that that's 3 Typhon visits back. And there was a great destruction at that time, which the book of Jasher records. And so that's the beginning of some of these sites in Israel. And then they come down, and there's a whole bunch of them. They begin to build, and you see some sites in Turkey. There's one in Syria, and there's a total of about half a dozen of these sites. And then, of course, we have Egypt, which goes back into this period. In fact, Plato in the Timaeus Dialogue talks about how the Egyptians at the time of the Atlanteans were, along with the Greeks, were fighting off these Atlantean invaders who'd come into the Mediterranean at this time. And this is the period from between about 13,000 BC and around 9600 BC, when the sinking of Atlantis occurs, and when you have the terminus of Egyptian pre-flood, if you will, or what you would call Ice Age civilization. I guess it's not pre-Ice Age, but the Ice Age period, which came to an end about 9600 BC. At that time, global sea level rose 375 feet, and it rose so fast, so rapidly, that they know that it happened in less than one human lifetime, because they can't slice the ice thin enough to find the demarcation point between the old situation and the new situation. There's a cataclysmic shift. Global sea level just surges upwards, and obviously something happens to the ice. It means there's a very rapid ice melting, and sea level goes up. And we know there's a massive tectonic deleveling event along the east coast of the United States, especially in the northeast New England area, where the land just suddenly lifts up out of the oceans in a body, a big slab coming up. It's like if you took an ice cube and you held it down below the water, and then you let go, it would pop up. Well, that's essentially what happened, almost actually literally what happened to North America when the ice melted. The weight was gone, and they had 2 or 3 miles thick ice cap on North America, southern Canada, northern U.S. states. And when that was removed suddenly, the land was not being pressed down into the molten lava that was floating in by the weight of the ice, and so it popped up like an ice cube. So it uplifted, and you had the fall line, the jagged rocky coast of Maine, as I like to call it, that created the Industrial Revolution, made it possible with all the waterfalls and everything, at least here in America. And it was obviously something so dramatic that it set out a massive tidal wave that swept the entire Atlantic basin. And we are told when Atlantis sank, that there were a series of earthquakes that occurred prior to the moment when Atlantis disappeared beneath the sea. And this would certainly fit this scenario. We know that during the period that immediately followed this, that Arctic and subarctic vegetation moved way south of the Arctic Circle region. And in fact, there were subarctic plants growing in Florida. In other words, the Earth's climate was acting odd. Now, the thing that characterizes these plants is they need very little sunlight. In other words, it looks as though the sky or the sun was dim. And that we're looking at a solar fluctuation. And this solar fluctuation had first evaporated up a lot of moisture, and then suddenly dumped it on the glaciers. And in the heat and the rain, it melted the glaciers. They suddenly go surging down, for example, the Mississippi River Basin down into the Gulf of Mexico. And the late Dr., I think he's passed away by now, Dr. Cesare Emiliani, back in the 1950s, when he was at the University of Chicago, first discovered this process of the rapid melt-off of the glaciers and the dating of it when it had occurred. And of course, it's been confirmed many times since then. So we know what basically was taking place. And by the way, he was courageous enough to relate this in the 60s and early 70s as he continued his work to the sinking of Atlantis. He said he had found evidence for the event that caused the sinking of Atlantis. And I don't think there's any doubt whatsoever that if there was an Atlantis at that time, this definitely would have sunk it. No question about it. You couldn't be on an island in the mid-Atlantic or the Caribbean without being swamped by this massive sudden increase of water that poured into the oceans and raised their height nearly 400 feet in a very, very short period of time. It could have been as short as a single year. It could have been that short. Now that's deluge-style increase, okay? And we know that the ablation of the glaciers would have to have required not just sunlight, but rain. And it would have meant that you had a dramatic change in the way things were. And that change, which came about so suddenly, should show up in the archaeological record at around 9600 BC. So, when I looked at the map in National Geographic, what did I see? I saw 6 settlements that dated to the period from 13,000 BC to 9600 BC. Only one of which appeared to exceed that and extend into the following period. But that could be misleading if somebody simply came back and reoccupied that site afterwards. It was up in the Turkish mountains at a place called Murray-Bet. And Murray-Bet probably is a reoccupied site. We know that there were in southern Syria, south of Ur or Edessa, there was a reoccupied site, but that was about 1,200 or 1,400 years later. So it just depends on how rapidly a site was reoccupied as to whether it appears to have extended across the barrier. I found, looking at about 30 different sites, those on the maps that they have and others that I was researching this week, that there was only that one place where you had an archaeological site that crossed over the 9600 BC barrier. Just one place. All the others either terminated and ended with it or began at that time, but in different locations. And so you can see very dramatically when you chart it, according to the dates, you can see very dramatically that there is a cutoff point at 9600 BC, where the old sites stop, and then a whole series of new sites begin. And guess what? The old sites were made out of stone, and the new sites were made out of mud bricks. Now, if the world had been flooded with heavy rainfall, and if there wasn't a whole lot of sunlight, the mud would have been the most readily available building material. And so the fact that all of these sites that begin in 9600 BC, and there's again about half a dozen of them, that they are built out of mud, tells me that this was a situation where the people took the most obvious, readily available building material and used that to make small villages. We know that the people who lived in these places, there were less than 100 people in each of these little towns that they were building out of these mud bricks. They did not farm. They appeared to be hunters and gatherers. Now, you can't farm if it's dark. If you've got subarctic vegetation trying to eke out survival in Florida, then very obviously they were having trouble engaging in agriculture, even if they knew how to do it. And apparently they had about 6,000 years before this. But by this time, they can't engage in agriculture. they are forced into hunting and gathering. Hunting whatever animals have survived, gathering up whatever plants they can find to eat. Subsistence living, very small settlements, very little indication of much in the way of human population development. Very crude conditions, and you're looking at 1,000 years or more of this. So for a long time, they had difficulty surviving. Now you look at Plato's Timaeus dialogue and in his Critias dialogue, and you can reconstruct a very strange phenomenon. There's a gap of 1,000, actually 1,100 years between the sinking of Atlantis and the end of the, if you will, pre-Atlantean, or I should say pre-Atlantean, but pre-sinking of Atlantis, Egyptian civilization, ending in 9600 BC. And then there's a long gap of about 1,000, 1,100 years down to 8500 BC. And it is in that period suddenly that the story of Egypt then picks up again in the Plato's narrative. And I thought about that, and I realized, well, there's a gap there. There's another gap up in Syria of about the same length, which I was telling you about earlier, where this town had been revived. And here you have these subsistence cultures of a few dozen people, little more than an extended family clan, hanging out in half a dozen villages scattered around Israel and Turkey. In fact, one of them was Jericho, which of course later becomes quite famous. And you look at these things and you think, well, gee, I mean, just a handful of human beings building mud structures and holding on to subsistence living, picking berries or whatever they could find to eat, and killing whatever animals happened to, unluckily, to wander by. And then the sun comes back. We know this because this cold snap ends, and all of a sudden, ordinary plants begin to appear. Oak trees begin to grow. Things that need lots of sunlight appear, and voila, magically, in the very same areas in Turkey and Syria and Israel, all of a sudden they're engaged in agriculture, cultivated grains. They're building their buildings now out of combinations of stone and clay walls and multiple complex structures, villages of thousands of people. Here in Maine, we call that a city. You know? And there are something like 8 or 10 of these places that appear in a short period of time after this warming begins. So you look at this, and they've got structures made out of wood and stone and clay and all of the modern building materials, no longer mud brick. They're engaged in agriculture, and it begins again along a broad front between about 8500 and 8200 BC. And once again, you're looking at a confirmation that a dramatic climate change has made it possible for human beings over a broad area not to invent agriculture, but to engage in it. They knew how to grow stuff. They just couldn't in the preceding period. Now let's go back to the time of Atlantis. We got, I put together a collection of about 8 or 9 different locales. And by 8 or 9, I mean whether you want to include Atlantis or not, depends. Atlantis was engaged in agriculture, according to Plato's record of it. They had chariots. They had all kinds of stuff. They had the wheel. Okay. But you know what you can't use a wheel in, don't you? Mud. So the fact that there are no wheels for 1,000 years because it's too muddy and the sun hasn't come back to make the ground hard again, doesn't necessarily mean that human beings were not smart enough to invent the wheel. It just means that they just didn't have the capability of utilizing it. So Gobekli Tepe is a regional site. In other words, nobody lives there, but people from all these surrounding places are coming there during this cold, dark period that follows what would appear to be a kind of ice age ending deluge event, accompanied by a solar dimming. Very strange twilight period, sometimes known by we Norsemen as the twilight of the gods, a period that's neither day nor night, as it says in the book of Zechariah. Flip that one by either. And so this is an unfolding series of sites. Now, in the pre-disaster locales, which are scattered over the same area, from Israel up into Turkey and down into Egypt, we have signs of fairly small locales, but they are stone sites. And I got to thinking about, well, gee, all we've got are stones, because it was washed away. If you had mud, brick, or anything that had the ability to be washed away by a deluge, it did not survive. So the only things that are left are stone huts. Things built out of other materials didn't make it. They got washed away. Remember the story of the three little pigs? And the big bad wolf comes along, and he comes along and somebody's made a house out of thatch, and, in other words, twigs and leaves and stuff, and he blows and he huffs and he puffs and he blows the house away. And that little pig runs over to the second pig's house, and the big bad wolf comes along, and that house is made out of wood. And he huffs and he puffs and he takes this wooden house and he blows it away. And now those two pigs race to the third pig's house, which is made out of, depending on how the version goes in your case, it's, brick or stone. And he huffs and he puffs and he can't blow it down. Well, this is an ancient kind of fairy tale that's really, these things are handed down for generations, and it really is telling you something about what apparently had happened here. People had learned a lesson that certain kinds of structures would stand up and certain kinds would not. And wooden buildings, like the ones we live in, they don't stand up too well. But stone structures and brick structures, they survive through these kinds of events. And they apparently were expecting something to happen because they were building their houses out of stones in the pre-flood world. And then in the post-flood world, they built out of mud. Because I suspect when they tried to build out of stone, it got so heavy it just sank into the ground. So you can actually see from the artifacts that are left behind this transition from stone structures to mud structures to structures built out of wood and clay and stone and all kinds of building materials, and really whole cities being built. You see human population growing. You can see, in other words, the pageant of events before, during, and after the flood period. Now, that's not all. When you look at the map that they've got on, I think it's page 43 and 44, I think it is, somewhere in there, they show that there is an expansion of these sites outward in various directions away from a central point on the map, showing where the dispersion occurred once agriculture and livestock became established in the post-disaster period. They don't think it's a disaster, of course. That's forbidden under Gordon Child's mindset of things. But what they show is there's a central point from which everything radiates. A point just a little bit downhill and to the west of the mountains of Ararat. In other words, this is a story laid out in archaeological stones and bones and artifacts that is telling us that there was a great disaster in 9600 BC when the world sea level rose almost 400 feet almost overnight, and that thereafter mankind radiated outwards and dispersed from the highlands of Turkey, not far from the mountains of Ararat, literally downriver from Ararat, and kept expanding downstream, down the Euphrates and Tigris valleys, down into Mesopotamia, which they don't reach until about 6000 BC. So Sumer is not the cradle of civilization. It's more like, I don't know, high school. It's well down the line. The civilization had already begun, and everything that they had attributed to ancient Sumer already existed in the thousands of years that preceded it. And rather clearly, it had existed before the flood, before the end of the last ice age. In that ice age period, there must already have been some level of human civilization. Well, the reason Gordon Childe could make such progress in persuading the archaeologists that he was right was because all of the people who believed in the short chronology of the Bible, that is to say that Adam lived 6,000 years ago and that there wasn't even a universe before then, all of those people couldn't say anything. Because, after all, Gordon Childe was saying, well, civilization begins 6,000 years ago. So they said, well, yeah, we agree with that. And then all of this time before then, they just ceded to him to play with, to make assertions about, all of which, as we've just shown, were false. But had they actually looked at the book of Genesis, they would have realized it doesn't have a short 6,000-year chronology. In fact, there's no such chronology of 6,000 years in your Bible anywhere. It's just not in there. The text is clearly giving us a history of a family. It is not telling us how old civilization is. For example, Adam says in chapter 2, "Here at last is bone of my bone, flesh of my flesh. She was taken. She shall be called Isha, because she was taken out of Ish." Those are the names that he's giving her and himself. And then he says, "Therefore Ish," meaning himself, "leaves his father and his mother, and goes and cleaves unto his Isha, and the two shall become one flesh," meaning he's going to go somewhere else away from his mother and father in order to have sex with Isha. Now, the narrator chimes in at this point and says, "And Adam and his Isha were both naked, and they were not ashamed." They were not embarrassed, because they'd gone someplace away from mommy and daddy. You see, he's naming everything in the garden. He identifies his mother and father as being present, and that he has to leave them to get some privacy to have sex with Isha, or, as he later calls her, Eve, or actually in Hebrew, Hava. So, we are told that there was a preceding layer of humanity, at least one, before his time. The Hebrew actually says that God pottered him out of the dust of the earth. That word formed there, pottered, means gradually transformed over a long period of time, and it would have indicated many generations, and in fact, many, many thousands of years. And this is the way the rabbis have always understood it. They always understood the Hebrew as referring to a very long period of development, and that Adam was actually the last of many such periods of development. And we are in the age of Adam, but that there were many others preceding it, at least 6. And they reckoned back, oddly enough, over 200,000 years of these pre-Adamic humans. And they got that from Genesis, from the Hebrew. Well, this idea of a short chronology historically is very new. It arose after the Christian apostolic age. It started to emerge in the sub-apostolic period into the 2nd century and took full blossom with Ambrose in the 4th century. Ambrose was a pagan Roman military aristocrat who appears to have taken his troops to the basilica in Milan and essentially appointed himself bishop. And he then starts preaching this idea of the 6,000-year-ago creation, which then influences Augustine and so on and so forth, and we end up with this idea that has become so popular in recent time. But even many of the churchmen did not agree with this notion of recent creation like that. And even Augustine first was talking about a creation not in 4,000 BC, but way back before that. He was looking back I'm sorry, I was saying 6,000 BC from the start of Sumer. I meant to say 4,000 BC was when Gordon Childe was saying that it had started. But 6,000 is where the archaeology is showing that there were people wandering into Sumer at that time, or in the vicinity of it. But it was not yet called Sumer because that's a different group of people who actually were living in the Black Sea area in 6,000 BC, which is to say 8,000 years ago. To distinguish between those two things here. But these ideas have come back to haunt us here in the post-World War II period, because a group of people calling themselves scientific creationists have suddenly revived this old notion of Ambrose's of a recent creation, and they have started pushing this as if that's what the Bible actually says, though they carefully skip some of these verses that I've been citing that obviously are consistent with that. We have all kinds of evidence, from historical evidence, from biblical evidence, to archaeological evidence, that fits this scenario quite nicely and shows that the deluge of Noah occurred in 9600 BC, or thereabouts, within a few years of it. And we can now actually look at the archaeology of it. We can see what happened to the people. It would be a great proof of the Bible. The emergence from the highlands of Turkey at the time shortly after this, the dispersion, just like you see in Genesis, everything fits perfectly except for the dates. But those dates are something of a misleading thing, because it turns out that the Hebrew word that's being translated year, Shania, simply means a cycle of time, or literally an unfolding. And you don't know which cycle it is unless you know the context. Well, now we know the context, and we can see what cycle it is. The cycle that fits is the sabbatical cycle of 7 years, the one which, by the way, is given in Genesis itself, with the 7 fat years and the 7 lean years. So you can take that back and go back to Genesis like a key in a lock, and you can unlock this mystery. And you can see that Genesis is talking about a chronology that extends back to 23,000 years ago. And you can see that this history here is about a people where Adam lived 23,000 years ago, where Noah lived 11,600 years ago, which is 9600 BC, before and after that, obviously, both. And this period of time where Gobekli Tepe is functioning would be a time when Noah was alive, and Shem, and Arpachshad, and that whole family. Now, what's curious about the name Arpachshad is the last part of it, Cad, could be the last syllable, the last 3 letters that you can see on that one stone there. K, E, or Haith, H, delta, D, if that is a delta there. And again, of course, I'm dealing with something that's partly in shadow, trying to interpret it from that. Obviously, these archaeologists are not going to help us out by telling us what letters they are. But based upon the photo, that might even be a pillar representing Arpachshad, or it may mean something else. But it's interesting. Here we have structures built during their lifetimes, if this is indeed the era of Noah. And it would seem to be, because there isn't any other global flood event between now and 23,000 years ago. Nothing like this happened except this particular event. And if you use the sevenfold chronology, and by the way, Genesis has more sevens in it than any other book in the Bible, and more that refer to, obviously, to chronology than any other book in the Bible. In fact, at one point, they even talked about, was it Lamech, 777 Shanaeas or cycles. So they're trying to point at this idea of a sevenfold chronology. Why did Joseph do that? Because he's the last guy to write, and obviously if anybody edited the book, it would have been Joseph. The answer is simple. Joseph was given an Egyptian wife, a woman who was the daughter of a priesthood, and that meant that she was part of the Egyptian priesthood. She was part of that priestly caste. She could read and write. She was sent there to spy on him as the wife that was given to him by Pharaoh. So for him to write down the history of the patriarchs of the flood and all of these times and chronologies and sneak them, if you will, out of Egypt. He says, you'll carry my bones up from hence, when God will visit you, right at the end of Genesis. Well, in order to sneak it out, he wanted to make sure that the Egyptians didn't take it too seriously. So I think he used a code, the sevenfold chronology, to conceal it from the Egyptians so that they wouldn't realize what secrets Joseph and the Israelites knew, so that when they came and fetched his bones and the scrolls of Genesis and took it out of Egypt, that they would be removing some of the greatest secrets of human history with them on the night of the Exodus, some 3,500 years ago. So these stones that we're now uncovering, mankind is finding from Turkey down into Egypt, the history of mankind's migrations and what he was doing before, during, and after the deluge. I think we now have solid evidence to point to that event, the date of it, the circumstances of it, the locations where people lived, and possibly even a monument or several monuments of the family of Noah themselves.
Gosh, Olaf, thank you. This was a very fascinating presentation. My goodness. Everybody, you can go to thetimequest.com. That's Olaf's personal site. And he also has a distributor for his materials at Before 2012 and Beyond.com.
Now, I hasten to add, that's not my site, so don't email me there. In fact, you can't email me at all at the moment because, unfortunately, I'm having internet problems again. So.
Oh, dear.
But anyway. But you can order the CDs and things that I have there. They do have specials involving CDs that relate to some of the topics we talked about tonight as well.
And you can also write to Olaf Hage at Post Office Box 427, Brunswick, Maine. And the abbreviation for Maine is ME. And the zip code is 04011. And thank you so much, Olaf. This was really interesting.
Oh, you're quite welcome.
And God bless everybody out there that's listening.
Yes.
Good night.